Our main story today are these extraordinary pictures between Kim Jong-un and President Putin shaking hands. The Estonian Defence Minister said to us just a short time ago he thinks this meeting is just a cover for Putin to buy weapons from North Korea. What do you think?
I suspect he's right. And I think it underlines the importance of Western resolve to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression, and more broadly to recognise that in the world in which we live, it's important for democracies to stand together and to cooperate. And, we often talk about our pride in 75 years of the NHS, and you'll hear Labour politicians often talk about our pride in founding the NHS. I am equally proud of the role that Labour government played after 1945 in the founding of NATO, which has been the cornerstone of our defence and security, freedom and democracy since 1948.
Is it a sign of desperation, do you think, of Russia depending on North Korea here?
I think Putin's been increasingly isolated on the world stage. I think he's left Russia increasingly in a position as a pariah state. We've made it consistently clear, our country, other European democracies, our problem isn't with the Russian people, who are often among Putin's victims. Our problem is with Putin's aggression. And I'm proud of the way that our country and others have stood with Ukraine to defend against Russian aggression, because we have to send a clear message to Putin and other tyrants around the world that we're not going to stand idly by as he attempts to trample over freedom, democracy and self-determination.
The other big news this morning is breaking economic news. GDP fell by 0.5% in the last section, worse than expected. What do you make of that?
I think it's another dismal day for Britain's economy and for growth, and we see the consequences of the Conservatives' economic mismanagement through higher bills, higher mortgages and higher taxes. And the knock-on consequences, we've got the highest burden of taxation in this country in 70 years. Growth isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet or a chart. It's the real-world consequences for families, for businesses and for our public services. One of the reasons why the last Labour government was able to invest in our public services and make sure that people were paid fairly without hiking up taxes to the degree that they have been hiked up by the Conservatives is because we had growth in the economy. And when you've got growth, you can invest, you can even reduce taxes, you can invest in public services, you can make sure people's wages keep up in line with inflation, so you avoid the appalling spectacle of the industrial action, the strikes that we see, including next week's NHS strikes, which I think potentially going to be the worst strikes the NHS has ever had. So there is a price we are all paying for economic mismanagement, and it's why Labour's number one priority, our number one mission for government, is to get growth back into our economy, to make sure that growth and the benefits of growth are felt fairly from people from all backgrounds and all parts of our country, and to make sure that competitively, internationally, our country is at the head of the pack, not lagging behind in the way that we are today.
You mentioned strikes, and of course these were singled out as one of the reasons why the GDP figures fell again in the last section. Yesterday, Angela Rayner told the TUC conference that the Labour Party would make it easier for workers to strike. I mean, doesn't that suggest that a Labour government would be even worse for the economy?
Not at all. I think it says that Labour's got a grown-up approach to industrial relations. This government seems to think you can legislate your way out of the problems we're seeing in the economy and amongst the workforce. That's not the case. We had more liberal laws under the last Labour government, better rights and protections for workers under the last Labour government, and yet we didn't have any national strikes in the NHS. Why? Because we treated NHS staff with respect, because we had growth in the economy and we could deliver the shortest waiting times, highest patient satisfaction in the history of the NHS, while also paying the workforce fairly. So I think the answer to where we are today on strikes is negotiation. I think it is appalling that the Prime Minister is having a photo op in Number 10 today rather than getting the doctors in to knock some heads together and thrash out a deal, because as the ONS reports, it's not just that we're seeing significant numbers of delayed and cancelled appointments and operations, which is awful for patients. This is harming the economy. And in fact, take the junior doctors dispute. The industrial action has already cost the NHS more than £1 billion. That's more than half of what junior doctors have asked for in terms of their pay settlement. So this is a government that's being penny-wise, pound-foolish, harming the NHS and harming the economy simultaneously. And I don't understand why, when the NHS crisis is one of the two biggest crises in our country today, and strikes are at the heart of the crisis now, why the Prime Minister hasn't met the doctors once, why the Health Secretary hasn't met them since March. What are these people doing to resolve the worst crisis in the history of the NHS?
So what would Labour do to fix the strikes that are added to this massive backlog?
The most important thing is to get the negotiations underway. I've met in recent weeks with the BMA, the British Medical Association, with the doctors, with the consultants, to hear the wide range of issues that they're raising as part of this dispute, pay being an important part of it, particularly for junior doctors, but I think there are a wide range of other issues. I think there is a deal there to be done, but it takes two to tango. And the Health Secretary says, my door's open, but I'm not going to talk to you about pay. Well, all Steve Barclay's doing is creating a drafty office, because unless you're willing to talk about all of the issues, you're not going to have negotiations, you're not going to end the strikes, patients are going to suffer, the economy is going to suffer. And I heard what the Health Minister said on your sofa this morning. She seems to think this is a badge of honour, a sign of success. I don't understand the logic of a government which is simultaneously harming the economy by failing to resolve these strikes and worsening NHS waiting lists. I've come to the conclusion that Rishi Sunak thinks this is a convenient scapegoat for 13 years of disastrous mismanagement of the NHS, the longest waiting list we had going into the pandemic. I think now he thinks, well, I'm not going to cut the waiting list, but at least I can blame the doctors.
Before you go, let me just ask you about one of the stories that's in the news this morning. Reports about MI5 warning the Conservatives, two of their MPs, two MP candidates could be spies for China. Of course, this comes after a parliamentary staffer was also suspected of being a spy. How concerned are you about this, and are you worried about your own party?
I think we've got to be extremely vigilant about interference in our democracy, whether that's espionage, sabotage, or seeking to exert undue influence. I applaud the work that our intelligence and security services are doing, by the way. I think so much of what they do understandably goes unseen, unheard by the British people. But when moments like this emerge, I think it is a reminder of the excellent work our intelligence and security services do. We've all got to be vigilant about this, and we need to make sure that whether it's China or other countries interfering in our democracy, that we've got the right safeguards in place to protect the integrity of our elections, the integrity of our democratic processes.
Wes Streeting, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.